at your foot, and you could say, ah, it is made of flesh and bone.
Or I could look at my foot and say, I use this to walk.
Yeah. Or you could look at your foot and say, ah, I'll pick this up and hit someone with it. It would be awkward. You could try. But that's not actually how you understand yourself.
Right. My question is, how do I understand you? I can look at you as present at hand, or I could look at you as really complicated, ready to hand.
Okay.
Can I look at you as Dasein? Does that mean anything?
So I've been leaving a lot out in this section. Heidegger talks a lot about what he calls Dasein with, which is not really any of those three options.
Okay.
But most closely related to Dasein. Basically, you look at me and understand that I'm the same sort of being as you. You can then, it is very, very common to view people as ready to hand or present at hand. A doctor is going to look at all of his patients as present at hand. A dictator or like manipulative person is going to look at people as ready to hand. But there is an alternative, which is this sort of understanding, sharing and understanding of the world. So you can work together with someone, and your Daseins, in a sense, sort of merge as you use the same tools for the same ends. Complicated, lots of pages written about it. I wanted to focus on this stuff because I think this is most interesting to me personally, because I'm interested in like its applications to science and that sort of thing. But there is a lot of stuff about that, especially in the second division, that we might talk about later. Any other questions?
Did Heidegger believe that there was some present at hand is fundamental to all Dasein?
Well, there's a sense in which interaction is mediated by the present at hand. You can't grab something that doesn't have some present at hand qualities. So in order to be the sort of being that can manipulate the world, you have to share that with it.
But let's say a robot can manipulate the world, but it isn't a Dasein.
Yes, but if a robot wasn't, okay, so robots and computers are complicated. There's a great book called What Computers Can't Do by Bert Dreyfus, who attempts to apply Heideggerian philosophy to artificial intelligence and get some interesting results. Insofar as a robot is merely following a list of instructions, it's not a Dasein. But there's no inherent reason why a robot couldn't become a Dasein if it had all of this structure, if it had a world which it saw as being as full of ready-to-hand things, if it had its own for the sake of which, if it were a robot that included all of these features, it would be a Dasein.
I guess my question is, if you don't mind me saying, Heidegger seems to think that the Dasein is the fundamental, if I understand right.
It's fundamental for meaning.
Right, but
who knows if it's fundamental physically? What does that even mean? How would we know that? How would we understand?
But if there's a present at hand that I guess defines the Dasein, then would that present hand then become fundamental to meaning?
I think this is, in a sense, more of an epistemological point than an ontological one, although definitely not entirely. The reason we start with Dasein is because we cannot understand the world any other way. The world doesn't have meaning without Dasein. And we can attempt to step out of our being a Dasein, but we will never successfully do so. That the world and all its structures and everything we know about it and everything we care about it all comes back to the structure of Dasein. Even science is fundamentally an activity of Dasein. Quantum physics would never be developed without Daseins around. Like, you're not going to have particles hitting each other, and one of the particles says, "Oh, I'm going to write particle physics now." Like, there is of necessity a Dasein involved for science to even happen. So, yes, we can talk about like a physical reality underlying Dasein, but to even talk about that presupposes Dasein. Like, everything we do, including talking about the present at hand, is part of the structure of Dasein.
So I hate to ask the Daniel question here, but what's the use value of the term? If we're talking about a term that has, to which no predicates or qualities are at all fundamental, there's no part of ourselves that we can point to as Dasein. We can't even seem to point to like consciousness or qualia as Dasein. So what is it then? What does it do for us besides giving us the ability to say that it's
Um, Dasein doesn't have predicates in the sense that it isn't present at hand. It doesn't have properties. That doesn't mean he believes it doesn't have a structure. And this is complicated, but basically, this whole idea of Dasein being in the world and having this ultimate, this for the sake of which, this its own utmost possibility, are things we can say about Dasein. They're not predicates because it's not an object that has properties, but they are things we can say about the structure of Dasein. And the reason that's important is because all our interactions with the world take place in this framework. That if we don't understand that, like for instance, so I was reading this book by, I think by Stephen Jay Gould, I don't know, someone about the history of attempts to measure intelligence. Talking about this guy who's measuring skull capacities to prove that the white race was more intelligent. And he did this by packing millet seeds into skulls and then pouring them out and like weighing them and figuring it out that way. Turns out, then he did it later again with BBs. And millet seeds were compressible and the BBs weren't, so he got more accurate with the BBs. Turns out he had been subconsciously influencing his data by pushing harder basically on the skulls he thought were going to be bigger. If, without understanding this structure of having this ultimate, for the sake of which, to which everything we do is related, having goals and any attempt, and science being a particular sort of interpretation applying to the world, that sort of thing is not going to be, it's going to be hard to talk about that because the process of science is supposed to be objective. And yes, you can say perfect science removes the subjective qualities, but that's never going to happen. And even the act of science requires the structure of Dasein for it even to ever have been thought of in the first place. It's probably not the best example, because I'm sure you could come up with ways of talking about subconscious influences without Dasein. But in order to understand who we are and what we do, if we don't understand who we ourselves are and what the structure of our interactions with the world is, we're never going to be able to understand the things we want to study in the world. We're never going to be able to talk about things meaningfully without first understanding why we're talking about them in the first place, what parts of ourselves lead us to this sort of interaction. Does that make any sense? So yes, I see. If Dasein were some sort of completely transcendent subject with absolutely no properties, then that would be a problem. But it's not that it doesn't have properties. It's not that it doesn't have structure. It's that it has a structure which is different from the sort of structure present at hand things can have. Any other questions?
I think this goes along with some of the questions. I know he was asking back there also. What does Heidegger